It was a crisp autumn evening when Emma decided to take the long route home. She had just finished a late shift at the restaurant, and the usual drive through the city was always too crowded, too noisy. She needed some space, some quiet. So, she chose to take the country road that wound its way through the woods route she had taken many times before. It was longer, sure, but there was something peaceful about it. The leaves had started to turn, casting a golden hue over the landscape, and the air was cool, sharp with the scent of pine. The drive was uneventful at first. The radio played softly in the background, a mix of old rock songs and quiet chatter from the late-night hosts. The headlights of her car cut through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead, but the trees on either side seemed to swallow up the light, making the woods feel even more dense and impenetrable. It wasn't long before Emma noticed the silence. Not the kind of silence that you'd expect late at night, but a deeper, more unsettling quiet. The usual sounds of the night crickets, the rustle of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl were completely absent. It was as if the world had gone still, holding its breath. Emma tried to shake off the feeling, adjusting the volume on her radio and telling herself it was just her imagination. But the silence persisted, the absence of sound almost too perfect, too unnatural. She glanced at the clock on her dashboard. It was just after midnight. She was almost halfway home when the first strange thing happened. Up ahead, she saw something on the side of the road. A car. It was an old sedan, rusted and abandoned, parked awkwardly in the grass. Emma slowed down, her headlights illuminating the vehicle. There were no other cars in sight, and the road was still empty. She was about to pass it when something caught her eye. A figure, a man, standing next to the car. He was tall, dressed in a long coat, and his face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. His posture was strange too still, as if he were waiting for something or someone. Emma slowed even further, her instincts telling her to stop, to offer help. But something in the pit of her stomach told her to keep going. She pressed her foot on the gas, her car rumbling past the figure. As she did, she glanced in her rearview mirror. The man hadn't moved. He was still standing there, staring at her car as she drove away. Emma quickly turned her attention back to the road, feeling her heart rate pick up. The strange unease in the pit of her stomach had only grown stronger. She couldn't explain it, but something about that man, something about the way he stood there, motionless, just felt wrong. She tried to focus on the road ahead, but her mind kept drifting back to the figure. The man hadn't even moved. He hadn't turned, hadn't looked away. He was like a statue, frozen in place. Another 5 minutes passed in tense silence before Emma's headlights flickered. It was brief, just a quick flicker, but it was enough to make her heart leap in her chest. She looked at the dashboard. The battery was fine. She had just had her car checked before the drive. The headlights flickered again. This time, the car jerked slightly, as if the engine had sputtered. Emma gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles turning white. She had never had a problem with the car before, and there was no reason for it to suddenly malfunction. Her hands were shaking as she reached for the radio, wanting to distract herself, to fill the silence with something, anything. But when she turned the knob, the radio was dead. Static filled the air, loud and harsh like a warning, then suddenly cut off. Her breath caught in her throat. She pressed the gas harder, trying to get through the dark stretch of road as quickly as possible. The woods around her seemed to close in, the trees pressing in on either side. The quiet was suffocating, and the only sound left was the pounding of her own heart, the occasional hum of the tires on the asphalt. Then, just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, she saw the lights ahead, the distant glow of a street lamp, a small roadside diner, the kind she used to stop at when she was younger. It wasn't much, just a small worn building with a flickering neon sign, but it meant she was nearing the end of the road, nearing the safety of civilization. She sped up, eager to reach it, but as she neared the diner, something stopped her. A figure, the same man standing in the middle of the road, blocking her path. Emma slammed on the brakes, her car screeching to a halt, just inches from the man. Her heart was racing now, the adrenaline pumping through her veins. She stared at him, her hands frozen on the wheel, unable to move. His back was to her, but she could tell he had heard her coming. The moment she stopped, he turned slowly, deliberately, his face still hidden beneath the brim of his hat. The silence returned, even heavier now, as if the world was holding its breath again. Emma didn't know what to do. She didn't know if she should reverse, speed away, or confront the man. All she could do was stare at him, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the man turned and walked off the road, disappearing into the woods. Emma waited, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The man had just walked away. Without a word, without a glance, he had simply turned and disappeared into the trees. Her eyes flicked back to the diner. The lights flickered once more, then went out completely. A chill swept over her. She had to leave. Emma slammed the car into reverse, her hands trembling as she shifted gears. She didn't care if she made a scene, she just needed to get away from that road, from whatever was out there waiting. As she backed up, her headlights caught something in the side mirror. A figure, standing at the edge of the woods, watching her. She whipped the steering wheel around, flooring the accelerator. The tires screeched as she sped away, not looking back. The road felt endless now, stretching out into the darkness. She didn't know how long she drove, but the sense of being followed, of something lurking just beyond the reach of her headlights, never left her. It wasn't until Emma reached the town that she allowed herself to breathe. The street lights, the noise, the lights from the houses, all of it felt like a return to safety. She pulled into her driveway, her hands still shaking from the adrenaline. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, eyes wide open, replaying the events over and over. The man, the silence, the strange way the world had felt like it was holding its breath. She never spoke about the incident to anyone. After all, who would believe her? It could have been a figment of her imagination, a product of exhaustion or stress, but the woods still felt like they were watching her. The quiet still haunted her, and every time she drove at night, her mind would drift back to that road, to the man with the wide-brimmed hat and the strange stillness in the air. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind rustled the trees outside her window, she would hear something soft tapping, just on the edge of hearing. A whisper, too faint to understand, but enough to send a chill down her spine. Sometimes, she would wonder if the man was still out there, waiting. It was the kind of house everyone in town whispered about. Perched at the end of Ridgewood Lane, its faded white paint peeled in long strips, revealing the rotting wood beneath. The windows were dark and dusty, the shutters hanging crookedly, and the front yard was an unkempt jungle of weeds and overgrown bushes. The locals called it the Marlowe House, though no one really remembered why. What everyone knew, however, was that the place was cursed. At least, that's what Olivia had heard growing up. At 23, she didn't believe in curses or ghost stories anymore, but the Marlowe house still gave her an uneasy feeling. Maybe it was the way the shadows seemed darker around it, or how even on sunny days, the house looked like it was trapped in perpetual twilight. Still, when her friend Eric suggested they check it out for fun, she couldn't say no. It wasn't like she had anything better to do on a Friday night. "You are really going through with this?" Olivia asked as Eric pulled up in front of the house in his beat-up sedan. "Of course," he said with a grin. "What's the worst that could happen? It's just an old house." Olivia sighed, wrapping her jacket tighter around herself as she stepped out of the car. The cool autumn air carried the faint smell of damp leaves and something she couldn't quite place, something metallic. Their other friends, Mia and Jason, were already waiting by the rusted gate, flashlights in hand. "Took you long enough," Mia said, flipping her long ponytail over her shoulder. "I was starting to think you chickened out." "Not a chance," Eric said, holding up a crowbar. Figured we might need this if the door's locked. Jason chuckled nervously. Let's just get this over with, okay? I've got work in the morning. The four of them approached the house, their footsteps crunching on the gravel path. Olivia glanced at the windows, half expecting to see a face staring back at her, but the house remained still and silent. When they reached the front door, Eric tested the knob. It didn't budge. Guess it's my time to shine, he said, wedging the crowbar into the gap between the door and the frame. With a grunt, he forced it open, the wood splintering with a loud crack. Inside, the air was heavy and stale, carrying the scent of mildew and decay. Olivia wrinkled her nose as she stepped over the threshold, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The interior was just as dilapidated as the exterior walls, covered in peeling wallpaper, floors littered with debris, and furniture draped in yellowing sheets. This place is disgusting, Mia said, covering her nose and mouth with her sleeve. What did you expect? A luxury hotel? Eric teased. They split up to explore, their flashlights casting eerie shadows on the walls. Olivia found herself in what must have been the living room. An old piano sat in the corner, its keys yellowed and warped. A painting hung crookedly above the fireplace, its subject obscured by decades of grime. This is so creepy, Mia said, joining her. Why do you think no one's torn this place down yet? Probably because it's private property, Olivia replied. Or maybe the town just likes having its own haunted house. Mia shivered. Let's just hope we don't find any dead bodies or something. Don't jinx it, Olivia muttered, her flashlight sweeping across the room. Meanwhile, Eric and Jason were upstairs, exploring the bedrooms. This place is falling apart, Jason said, kicking at a loose floorboard. You really think it's haunted? Eric shrugged. Who knows? But if it is, maybe we'll catch something on camera. You brought a camera? Of course, Eric said, pulling a small camcorder from his jacket pocket. Gotta document the experience. Jason rolled his eyes. You are ridiculous. Back downstairs, Olivia and Mia were inspecting the kitchen when they heard a loud thud from above. What was that? Mia whispered, her eyes wide. Probably Eric or Jason, Olivia said, though her voice wavered. They waited, but no one called out. Eric? Jason? Olivia shouted, her voice echoing through the empty house. No response. The two women exchanged uneasy glances before heading toward the staircase. Guys, are you okay? Mia called as they climbed the creaking steps. When they reached the top, they found Eric and Jason in the hallway, staring at a door at the far end. What's going on? Olivia asked. Listen, Eric said, gesturing toward the door. They fell silent, straining to hear. At first, there was nothing but the sound of their own breathing. But then, faintly, they heard a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on wood. Is there someone in there? Mia whispered. There shouldn't be, Eric said. This place has been abandoned for years. Olivia felt her stomach twist. Maybe we should leave. Not yet, Eric said, his curiosity getting the better of him. He approached the door, gripping the handle. Eric, don't, Jason said, his voice trembling. But Eric didn't listen. He turned the knob and pushed the door open, revealing a small, dark room. At first it looked empty, but then Olivia's flashlight caught something in the corner of a wooden rocking chair, slowly moving back and forth. Okay, that's enough, Mia said, grabbing Eric's arm. Let's get out of here. Eric hesitated, but eventually nodded. They turned to leave, but as they stepped into the hallway, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. What the hell? Jason shouted, his voice echoing through the house. Eric tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It's stuck. Let's just go, Olivia said, her heart pounding. But as they made their way down the stairs, the air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to deepen. The house felt alive now, as if it were watching them, waiting for something. When they reached the front door, they found it closed, though none of them remembered shutting it. Eric tried the knob, but it was locked. This is not funny, Mia said, her voice shaking. I am not joking, Eric said, yanking on the door. Olivia felt a chill run down her spine. We need to find another way out. They turned back toward the house, But the moment they did, the lights in their flashlights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. "Stay close," Olivia said, her voice barely above a whisper. They moved together, feeling their way through the house. The air was thick now, oppressive, and the faint sound of whispers seemed to come from all around them. "Do you hear that?" Jason asked, his voice trembling. "Keep moving," Eric said, his bravado gone. They reached the kitchen, where they found a door leading to the backyard. It was locked, but Eric used the crowbar to pry it open. As they stepped outside, the whispers stopped, and the air felt lighter. "Let's get out of here," Olivia said, her voice firm. They ran to the car, not looking back, and piled in. Eric started the engine and sped away, the Marlowe house disappearing in the rearview mirror. As they drove, no one spoke. The silence was heavy, each of them lost in their own thoughts. It wasn't until they were back in town that Mia broke the silence. "Do you think it's over?" "I don't know," Olivia said, staring out the window. But deep down, she wasn't so sure. It was almost midnight when Ethan pulled into the dimly lit gas station on the edge of town. He was on his way back from visiting his parents in the next state over, a drive he'd made countless times before. But tonight, something felt off. The road had been eerily empty, and as his car's low fuel light blinked on, he realized he hadn't seen another vehicle in nearly an hour. The gas station was one of those old rundown places that seemed stuck in time. The neon open sign buzzed faintly in the window, and the fluorescent lights above the pumps flickered sporadically. Ethan parked his car near the first pump, turned off the engine, and stepped out into the cool night air. As he started to fill his tank, he glanced around. The place was deserted, save for an old sedan parked near the side of the building. The windows of the car were fogged up, and he couldn't see anyone inside. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, but he shook off the feeling. It was just a quiet night, he told himself. Inside the station, a single cashier stood behind the counter, staring at a small television mounted on the wall. The man looked to be in his late 50s, with a grizzled beard and tired eyes. Ethan finished pumping his gas and headed inside to grab a coffee for the rest of the drive. The door jingled as he entered, and the cashier glanced up briefly before returning his attention to the television. Ethan grabbed a cup and poured himself some coffee, noticing how unnaturally quiet it was inside. There was no music, no hum of refrigeration units, just the faint sound of the television and the occasional creak of the building settling. As he approached the counter, the cashier's eyes met his. "You were out late," the man said, his voice raspy. "Yeah, heading back home," Ethan replied, trying to sound casual. "It's been a long drive." The cashier nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on Ethan for a moment too long. "Be careful out there. Strange things happen at this hour." Ethan forced a smile, paid for his coffee, and headed back to his car. As he stepped outside, he noticed the old sedan was still parked in the same spot. The fogged-up windows seemed even thicker now, and he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. He quickened his pace, got into his car, and locked the doors. Taking a sip of his coffee, he started the engine and pulled out of the station. As he drove, he couldn't stop glancing in his rearview mirror. The road behind him was empty, but he couldn't shake the sense that he wasn't alone. The coffee sat untouched in the cup holder as his unease grew. About 10 minutes later, his headlights caught something up ahead, a figure standing on the side of the road. As he got closer, he realized it was a man, waving his arms frantically. Ethan slowed down, his heart pounding. The man looked disheveled, his clothes dirty and torn. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide with fear. Ethan rolled down his window slightly. "Are you okay?" The man stepped closer, his voice trembling. "Please, you have to help me. They're coming." "Who's coming?" Ethan asked, glancing around nervously. The man didn't answer. Instead, he pointed back down the road, his hand shaking. Ethan hesitated. He wanted to help, but something about the man's demeanor set him on edge. "Get in," Ethan finally said, unlocking the passenger door. The man climbed in quickly, slamming the door behind him. "Thank you," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Ethan started driving again, stealing glances at his passenger. The man was breathing heavily, his hands gripping his knees. "What happened?" Ethan asked. "They were following me," the man said, his voice shaky. "I don't know who they are, but they've been chasing me since I left the gas station." Ethan's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "What do you mean? Did you see them?" The man shook his head. "No, but I heard them. They were in the woods whispering. I ran as fast as I could." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He glanced in the rearview mirror again, half expecting to see something emerging from the darkness, but the road was still empty. As they drove, the man grew quieter, staring out the window with a vacant expression. Ethan's unease grew. Something about the man didn't feel right, but he didn't know what to do. About 20 minutes later, they reached a small rest stop with a lit parking lot. Ethan pulled in, planning to call the police and let them handle the situation. "You can wait here," Ethan said, turning to the man. But when he looked over, the passenger seat was empty. Ethan's heart stopped. He slammed on the brakes and looked around the car, but there was no sign of the man. The passenger door hadn't opened, and he hadn't heard anything. He got out of the car, his hands trembling. The lot was empty, and the surrounding woods were silent. It was as if the man had vanished into thin air. Ethan stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Finally, he got back into his car and drove away, his heart racing the entire time. When he got home, he locked all the doors and windows and sat in his living room, unable to shake the feeling that he was still being watched. The next day, he told a friend about the experience, leaving out some of the stranger details. His friend frowned. "Did you say you picked him up near the gas station on Ridge Road?" "Yeah," Ethan said. His friend's expression darkened. "You were not the first person to see him. A guy matching that description died on that stretch of road years ago, hit by a car late at night. They say his spirit still wanders, trying to warn people about something horrible out there." Ethan didn't know what to say. He never went back to that gas station or drove that stretch of road at night again, but every so often, when he was alone in his car, he couldn't help but glance at the passenger seat, half expecting to see the man sitting there, staring silently out the window. It all started when I decided to move to a new apartment in Chicago. I had grown tired of my cramped studio in the city's outskirts, and finally found a spacious one-bedroom in a historic building closer to downtown. The price seemed too good to be true for the location, but the landlord explained the building was undergoing renovations, which explained the low rent. The place had charm-exposed brick walls, tall ceilings, and large windows overlooking the street, but there was something about it that felt off. The apartment was eerily quiet, even during the day. I chalked it up to being on the top floor of an older building. The first night, I was unpacking boxes when I heard faint footsteps above me. I paused, confused. I was on the top floor. There shouldn't have been anyone above me. I dismissed it, assuming the sound had carried over from another unit. By the third night, the noises had escalated. It was no longer faint footsteps, but heavier thuds, like someone pacing back and forth. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself the building's old pipes were to blame. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud crash. It sounded like something heavy had fallen in my apartment. I jumped out of bed and turned on the lights, my heart racing. I checked the kitchen, the living room, and even the bathroom, but nothing seemed out of place. As I was about to go back to bed, I noticed something unsettling. The chair at my small dining table had been pulled out, angled like someone had been sitting there. I hadn't touched it since I unpacked it the day before. The next morning, I asked my landlord if anyone else had ever complained about strange noises in the building. He hesitated before admitting that the last tenant in my unit had broken their lease and moved out early. They said they felt uneasy, he explained vaguely. That night, I was determined to sleep soundly. I double-checked that all the windows and doors were locked and even left a lamp on in the living room. But just as I began to drift off, I heard the pacing again. This time, it was louder, more deliberate. I threw off the covers and stomped into the living room, determined to catch whatever was causing the noise. As soon as I entered, the sound stopped. The room was eerily still, the only movement coming from the flickering light bulb in the corner. Something caught my eye, a faint smudge on the window pane. I stepped closer and realized it was a handprint. It was too high to have been made from the inside, and my windows didn't open. I hardly slept that night. The next day, I called a friend, Lauren, and told her about what had been happening. She offered to stay over, saying I was probably just stressed from the move. I was grateful for the company. When Lauren arrived, I felt a little safer. We spent the evening watching movies and joking about my haunted apartment. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere changed. The pacing started again, louder than ever. Lauren froze, her eyes wide. "Okay, that isn't your pipes," she whispered. We decided to investigate together, armed with my phone flashlight and a kitchen knife Lauren had grabbed. We checked every inch of the apartment, but there was nothing unusual until we reached the bedroom. The closet door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had closed it earlier. Lauren motioned for me to open it, and I hesitated before pulling it open in one swift motion. The closet was empty, except for a single piece of paper lying on the floor. It was an old photograph, yellowed with age. It showed a family, a man, woman, and little boy standing in front of what looked like my building. Written on the back in faded ink were the words, "November 1972, the last happy day." Lauren and I stared at each other, unsure of what to do. She suggested we leave, but I was reluctant to abandon my new apartment. Instead, we decided to stay awake for the rest of the night. Around 3 a.m., we both heard it, at the same time a low, guttural whisper coming from the hallway. The words were indistinct, but they sent a chill down my spine. We sat frozen on the couch, clutching our makeshift weapons, as the whispers grew louder, circling the apartment. Suddenly, the lamp in the living room flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. Lauren grabbed my arm. "We need to leave now." We bolted out of the apartment, not stopping until we were outside on the street. I called the landlord the next morning and demanded to know more about the building's history. Reluctantly, he told me about a tragedy that had occurred decades ago. In the early 1970s, a man named Richard had lived in my unit with his family. According to the landlord, Richard's wife had been having an affair, and in a fit of rage, he had murdered her and their son before taking his own life. The apartment had been vacant for years afterward, and whenever it was rented, tenants never stayed long. I moved out that same week. To this day, I refuse to drive past that building, let alone set foot inside. Lauren and I still talk about that night occasionally, and though we try to laugh it off, we both know what we experienced wasn't just in our heads. Whatever was in that apartment, it didn't want company. I used to work the graveyard shift at a small 24-hour gas station off the highway. It was one of those places that always felt desolate, no matter the time of day. The station had seen better days. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, and the aisles were crammed with dusty shelves of snacks that never seemed to sell. The night shifts were usually quiet, with a few truckers stopping in for coffee, or the occasional late-night traveler filling up their tank. I spent most of my time behind the counter, scrolling through my phone or pretending to read a book. One night, around 2 a.m., I was leaning against the counter, half asleep, when the sound of tires crunching on gravel jolted me awake. A beat-up sedan pulled into the lot, its headlights cutting through the fog that had settled over the highway. The car idled for a moment before the driver stepped out. He was a tall, lanky man wearing a dirty hoodie and jeans. His face was partially obscured by the hood, but I could see his eyes sharp and unblinking, like he was sizing me up. "Evening," I said as he walked in. He didn't respond, just gave me a nod. and started wandering the aisles. I tried to focus on my phone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The man wasn't browsing like a normal customer. He was pacing, stopping every so often to glance at me over his shoulder. After a few minutes, he approached the counter with a pack of gum. "That all for you?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at me, his lips curling into a faint, unsettling smile. "You work here alone?" he finally asked. I hesitated. "Yeah, it's just me." "Why?" "No reason," he said, sliding a crumpled bill across the counter. I gave him his change, and he lingered for a moment before turning and walking out. But instead of getting into his car, he leaned against it, lighting a cigarette and staring into the station. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Something about the way he was watching me made my skin crawl. I pretended to be busy, organizing the shelves behind the counter, but I couldn't help glancing at him every few seconds. After what felt like an eternity, he got back into his car and drove off. I let out a shaky breath, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. About an hour later, the station was quiet again, and I had almost forgotten about the man when I heard the faint sound of gravel crunching outside. My heart sank as I looked up and saw the same beat-up sedan pulling into the lot. This time, the man didn't get out. He just sat there, his headlights off, the outline of his figure barely visible through the windshield. I stared at the car, waiting for him to make a move, but he just stayed there, motionless. I grabbed my phone and debated calling the police. But what would I say? A guy bought gum and then came back to sit in his car? It wasn't exactly a crime. Then the phone rang. The station's landline hardly ever rang, especially at this hour, so the sudden noise made me jump. I answered, my voice shaky. "Hello?" There was silence on the other end, followed by a faint, raspy breathing. "Hello?" I repeated, louder this time. A low chuckle came through the line, sending a chill down my spine. "You should lock the doors," a voice whispered before the line went dead. I slammed the phone down and immediately ran to the front door, twisting the lock. My hands were trembling as I flipped the sign to closed and pulled the blinds shut. I grabbed the small baseball bat we kept behind the counter for emergencies and crouched down, trying to steady my breathing. I peeked through the blinds, but the car was gone. For the next hour, I sat there, every creak of the building making my heart race. I kept checking my phone, wishing I had called someone earlier. Just as I was starting to think the man had left for good, I heard a noise from the back of the station, like something tapping against the glass. My stomach dropped. I crept toward the storage room, clutching the bat tightly. The sound grew louder, more insistent. When I reached the back door, I saw the silhouette of a man standing outside, his head tilted as if he were listening. I backed away, trying not to make a sound, but I must have stepped on something because the man's head snapped toward the door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice muffled through the glass. "Open up!" I shook my head, even though he couldn't see me. He banged on the door harder, the glass rattling in its frame. "I just need to use the bathroom," he said, his tone eerily calm. "I didn't respond." After a few minutes, the banging stopped. I waited, listening for any sign of movement, but it was dead silent. I peeked through the small window in the door, but the man was gone. I thought about making a run for my car, but the idea of stepping outside terrified me. Instead, I called the police, finally deciding I had enough of this nightmare. When the officers arrived, I felt a wave of relief. I explained everything to them, from the man's strange behavior to the phone call and the banging on the back door. They searched the area and found footprints in the dirt near the back of the station, leading into the woods behind the building. One of the officers told me to stay inside while they investigated. I waited, my nerves frayed, until they came back about 20 minutes later. They hadn't found anyone, but they did find something. One of the officers handed me a small, folded piece of paper they had found, tucked into the doorframe at the back. I opened it with trembling hands. Scrawled in messy handwriting were the words, "You can lock the doors, but that won't keep me out." I quit the job the next day. To this day, I don't know what that man wanted or why he chose me, but I am just glad I never had to find out. I used to work part-time as a lifeguard at a water park during the summer. It wasn't one of those massive, famous parks you see in commercials. It was smaller, tucked away off a highway, surrounded by thick woods, the kind of place that drew families during the day but turned into a ghost town at night. One summer, the park management decided to host midnight slides, where the park stayed open until midnight every Friday. They thought it would boost ticket sales, and it died at first. But by the third week, the novelty had worn off, and only a handful of people showed up. On the final midnight slide event, the park was unusually quiet. By 11 p.m., most of the guests had left. It was just me, another lifeguard named Mike, a janitor, and the night manager, Carla. We were supposed to close up at midnight, but with no one around, Carla decided we could start shutting things down early. Mike and I were assigned to do a final walkthrough of the slides and pools to make sure no one had lingered behind. We split up. Mike headed toward the wave pool while I checked the lazy river and the taller slides. The lazy river was empty, the water eerily still. The floating inner tubes bobbed gently, but there was no sound except for the faint hum of the filtration system. I walked the perimeter, shining my flashlight into the water, just in case. When I was satisfied no one was there, I made my way to the tall slides. These were the big attractions, 3 twisting water slides that towered over the park. They were accessed by a long, spiraling staircase. As I climbed the stairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It's hard to describe, but you know that prickly sensation you get on the back of your neck? That was exactly how I felt. I stopped halfway up and shined my flashlight around. But there was nothing, just the shadows of the staircase and the distant glow of the park's lights. I reached the top and checked each slide. The water was still running, rushing down the chutes into the plunge pool below. Everything seemed fine, but the uneasy feeling lingered. I decided to head back down and meet up with Mike. As I descended, I heard something strange. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper, but it grew louder with each step. It sounded like someone saying my name, Danny. I froze, gripping the railing. The voice was soft, almost playful, but it echoed in the empty staircase, sending chills down my spine. Mike, is that you? I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. No answer. I picked up my pace, practically running down the stairs. When I reached the bottom, I looked around, but there was no one there. The park was still eerily quiet. I radioed Mike. Hey, are you messing with me? What are you talking about? He replied. His voice sounded genuinely confused. Never mind, I said, not wanting to explain over the radio. I decided to do one last sweep of the plunge pool area. As I walked toward it, I noticed something strange. One of the slides, the middle one, had water flowing down it, but it looked wrong. The water wasn't clear. It was dark, almost black. I stepped closer, shining my flashlight on the slide. The dark water seemed to shimmer, like it was moving in ways water shouldn't. And then I saw a hand. A pale, wet hand reached out from the slide, gripping the edge. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hands. Hey, whoever's there, come out, I shouted. The hand slid back into the darkness, disappearing into the black water. I bolted, running toward the wave pool where I knew Mike would be. I found him standing by the edge, staring into the water. Mike, we need to get out of here, I yelled. He turned to me, his face pale. Did you see it too? See what? He pointed to the wave pool. I thought I saw someone floating in there, but when I got closer, they disappeared. It was like they weren't really there. Before I could respond, the park's lights flickered. The hum of the filtration systems grew louder, almost deafening, and the air felt heavy, like a storm was about to hit. Carla's voice crackled over the radio. Guys, where are you? The cameras are picking up movement near the slides. I grabbed my radio. Carla, we're at the wave pool. We saw something. I don't know what, but we need to leave. There was a pause before she responded. "The cameras aren't working now. Meet me at the front office, now." Mike and I didn't need to be told twice. We sprinted toward the office, but as we passed the slides, I glanced back. The middle slide, the one with the dark water, was dry. The water wasn't running anymore, but I could still hear it rushing in my ears. When we reached the office, Carla was waiting for us, her face tense. "What's going on?" she asked. We tried to explain, but it sounded ridiculous even to us. Pale hands, disappearing figures, black water. It sounded like something out of a bad horror movie. Carla didn't seem convinced, but she agreed to call it a night and lock up early. As we were leaving, I noticed something on the ground near the office door. It was wet footprints, leading away from the building and back toward the slides. We didn't stick around to investigate. I quit the job a week later, unable to shake the feeling that whatever was in the park that night wasn't done with us. Mike stuck around for a little while longer, but he eventually left too. To this day, I don't know what we saw. Maybe it was just our imaginations running wild. Or maybe the park wasn't as empty as we thought. I used to work as a photographer for a local travel blog, and one weekend I was tasked with capturing the essence of a small, off-the-beaten-path hotel located by a lake about 2 hours from the city. It wasn't a big name or anything, more like a quaint hidden gem that people stumbled upon during their travels. When I arrived, the place seemed perfect, tucked away in the woods, surrounded by trees and a beautiful view of the lake. The hotel itself was an old 2-story building with a classic rustic charm. It had that old wooden exterior with ivy creeping up the walls, and the air smelled fresh with a touch of pine, the perfect place to disconnect from the hustle and bustle of the city. The manager, a man in his late 40s, welcomed me inside. He seemed friendly enough, though there was something a little off about him, had a strange intensity in his gaze. But I brushed it off as the usual quirkiness of someone who ran a small business on their own. He showed me to my room and handed me the key, which was attached to a wooden tag with the number 7 carved into it. He gave me a quick, almost too enthusiastic smile before leaving me alone. The room was small, but cozy. A queen-size bed, a desk by the window overlooking the lake, and a small bathroom with a clawfoot tub. The vibe of the place was perfect for what I had in mind for my photos, so I started unpacking my gear and setting up for the shoot. By the time I finished, it was getting dark. I decided to head downstairs to the lounge for a drink. The hotel was quiet, and the only sounds were the faint hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen and the creak of the wooden floors beneath my feet as I walked to the bar. The bartender was a young woman, probably in her early 20s. She greeted me with a smile, but seemed distracted. After a few minutes of small talk, I noticed her gaze kept flickering to the corner of the room, like she was waiting for something or someone. I asked her if everything was all right, and she hesitated before replying. "Oh, it's nothing," she said quickly. "It's just, the place gets a little strange at night." I asked her what she meant, but she just shook her head, as though not wanting to get into it. The conversation shifted, and I didn't press the matter any further. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The hotel had an odd, tense atmosphere to it, like it was holding a secret, and I felt like I was just on the edge of discovering it. Around 10 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I'd had a long day, and I was eager to get some rest before heading back to the city in the morning. As I walked back to my room, I heard muffled voices coming from behind one of the closed doors on the second floor. I stopped and listened for a moment. It sounded like someone was talking, but the words were hard to make out. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the walls of the old hotel carrying the sound. But when I reached my room, I noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar, as if someone had entered while I was gone. I was sure I had locked it when I left, but now it was open just a crack. I stepped inside, my heart racing. The room was exactly as I had left it, except for one thing. The window was open. The curtains were gently swaying in the cool breeze, and the latch was undone. I immediately closed the window and locked it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in here. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe the manager had come in to check on something, but the uneasy feeling lingered. The next morning I woke up to a strange sight. The hotel was foggy, covered in a thick layer of mist that seemed to settle over the lake. As I walked downstairs for breakfast, I saw the manager and the bartender talking quietly in the corner. They stopped when they saw me approaching, but I could tell something was wrong. There was a tension in the air that hadn't been there the night before. As I ate my breakfast, I overheard bits of their conversation. They weren't speaking directly to each other, but more like they were talking around something, trying to avoid saying whatever was on their minds. The manager's voice dropped to a whisper, and I strained to hear. Not supposed to be here. He's coming back soon. I couldn't make out the rest, but it sent a chill down my spine. Who was coming back? And why was it such a big deal? I decided not to confront them about it, but I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something was deeply wrong with this place. I spent the rest of the morning shooting photos around the property, trying to get a feel for the place. The hotel had a strange history, that much was clear. Several times I found small, strange artifacts in the corners of the room-sold photos, dusty books, and framed newspaper clippings, all of them having something to do with the hotel's past. Most of them were from decades ago, but there were a few newer ones that seemed out of place. One of the photos caught my eye. It showed the hotel from years ago, but the people in the picture were all strangely blurred, their faces obscured. I couldn't stop staring at it, feeling an unsettling sense of déjà vu. It was like I had seen these people before, but I couldn't place where. As I prepared to leave, I went to check out with the manager. He was standing behind the counter, his face pale and strained. When I handed him the key, he didn't say anything at first. He just stared at it for a moment before looking up at me with a haunted expression. "You are leaving already?" he asked quietly. "It's not safe to leave just yet." I laughed nervously, thinking it was some sort of joke, but when I saw the genuine fear in his eyes, the smile faded from my face. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice faltering. "What's going on here?" He hesitated, then spoke in a low voice, like he didn't want anyone else to hear. "The hotel? It's not what it seems," he said. "I hear is a reason it's been so quiet here for years. People who stay too long, they don't leave the same. You should go, it's better that way." At that moment, I felt the air grow colder. The unease I had been feeling all morning reached its peak. I turned quickly and walked out of the hotel, not looking back. When I got home, I tried to put the whole experience out of my mind. I'd gotten the shots I needed, and I was happy to be back in the city. But something stuck with me about that place, the strange atmosphere, the cryptic warnings from the staff, and the photo I couldn't forget. It was as if the hotel, or whatever was tied to it, had left a mark on me. I don't know if I'll ever go back, but I can't shake the feeling that I've only scratched the surface of whatever dark history lies behind the walls of that forgotten hotel. I had always been a fan of hiking and the outdoors, so when my friend Mark invited me to spend a weekend at a secluded cabin in the woods, I didn't hesitate. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, a chance to escape from the fast-paced world we lived in. The cabin was located deep in the forest, far from any distractions, and Mark promised it would be the perfect getaway. The cabin itself was an old rustic building, wooden walls, a stone fireplace, and a porch that overlooked a serene lake. It looked exactly like something you'd see in a movie, the kind of place that felt like it could hold 1,000 untold stories. It was just the two of us for the weekend, and I was excited to get away from everything. When we arrived, it was late in the afternoon, and the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees. The air was cool and crisp, and the smell of pine and earth filled the air. We unloaded our bags, set up our gear, and spent the next few hours exploring the area around the cabin. There was a small dock by the lake, and we spent some time sitting there, just enjoying the quiet. It felt like we were the only ones in the world. That evening, we cooked dinner over the fire, laughing and talking about old memories. It was a perfect night until things started to feel off. As the night deepened, the temperature dropped, and the woods surrounding the cabin grew eerily silent. No crickets, no rustling, leave just dead silence. Mark and I looked at each other, both feeling the shift in the air. We chalked it up to being in a remote location, far from any other people. It was just the isolation, we told ourselves. After dinner, we went inside, stoked the fire, and settled into the living room with a couple of beers. We spent the next hour talking about random topics, but as the fire crackled, I felt like I was being watched. I couldn't explain it, but it was a strange, unsettling sensation. I kept glancing out the cabin's large windows, expecting to see someone or something standing in the trees, but there was nothing. Finally, Mark mentioned it too. "Hey, do you feel like someone's out there?" he asked, his voice sounding a little tense. I nodded, not wanting to admit how much the silence was getting to me. "Yeah, I've been feeling that too." We tried to brush it off, but the strange feeling persisted. It wasn't until later, when we decided to call it a night, that things started to get really weird. I was in the bathroom, washing up, when I heard a faint knocking sound coming from the front door. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the knocks became more distinct, like someone was lightly tapping on the wood. I froze. Mark had already gone to bed, and there was no one else around. My heart started to race. I waited a few seconds, but the knocking stopped. I quickly finished up and went to check the door. There was no one there. I stood there for a moment, staring at the darkness outside, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The woods were silent again, but the unease in my stomach wouldn't go away. I locked the door and double-checked the windows before heading to bed. The rest of the night was restless. Every creak of the cabin seemed amplified. Every whisper of wind outside felt like it was coming closer. I kept waking up, scanning the room, wondering if someone had gotten in. But each time, I found nothing. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was already high in the sky. Mark was up too, making coffee in the kitchen. I didn't mention the knocking to him at first, thinking maybe I'd just imagined it. But then, Mark turned to me with a strange look on his face. "Did you hear anything last night?" he asked, his voice low. I hesitated for a moment before answering. "Yeah, I thought I heard knocking at the door, but when I checked, no one was there." Mark's face went pale. I heard it too, but it wasn't just knocking. It was like someone was scratching at the door, real slow. "I thought it was you messing around, but when I looked, there was nothing." A chill ran down my spine. We both tried to act normal, but the rest of the day was clouded by a sense of unease. We decided to spend the afternoon walking through the woods, hoping to distract ourselves. But even in broad daylight, the forest didn't feel right. The trees seemed to close in around us, and the air was thick with an unnatural stillness. It was as if the whole forest was holding its breath. As we walked deeper into the woods, we stumbled upon something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. A small clearing with a pile of old weathered bones scattered on the ground. The bones were animal, but there was something unsettling about them, something off, as if they had been placed there deliberately. I took a step back, my heart pounding. Mark looked at me, wide-eyed. "This wasn't here last time," he said, his voice shaky. "I've been up here before, and I've never seen this." We didn't stick around for long. We turned around and headed back to the cabin, both of us feeling the weight of the discovery. As we reached the cabin, we both noticed something that made our blood run cold. The door was wide open. We hadn't left it open, and we were sure we had locked it before we left. I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at the door, my mind racing. Mark moved forward cautiously, and I followed him inside. The cabin was in disarray. The furniture was overturned, and the fire pit had been disturbed. Someone had been in here. But how? There was no sign of forced entry, no broken windows, nothing that suggested anyone had come through the front door. We checked the rest of the cabin, our nerves on edge, but the place seemed empty. I wanted to call the police, but the cabin was so far from civilization, and I wasn't even sure what we'd tell them. We didn't have any proof of a break-in, just this overwhelming feeling that something was terribly wrong. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the sounds of something scratching at the door again, like it had been the night before. I would wake up in a cold sweat, convinced that someone or something was out there. By the morning, Mark was already packing his things. "We're leaving," he said, his voice tight. "I don't care what's going on here, but I am not staying another night." Neither of us said much during the drive back to the city. We were both too shaken up by what had happened. The knocking, the bones in the woods, the disturbance in the cabinet was all too much. When we got home, we tried to forget about it, but it wasn't easy. I never went back to that cabin, and Mark, well, he never mentioned it again. But every now and then, I'll find myself thinking about the scratching sounds, the bones in the woods, and the eerie feeling that we weren't alone in those woods. And I can't shake the feeling that whatever was out there, it's still watching. It was supposed to be a weekend trip to visit my cousin Sarah, who had recently moved into an old house in the small town of Wilton. Sarah had been raving about the place for weeks, claiming it had a vintage charm that she couldn't resist. The house was located on the outskirts of town, on a quiet street called Maple Street. She said it was perfect for her and her family, but there was something in her voice that made me feel uneasy when she described it. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, old houses can have a certain charm, right? They've got character and history. I packed my bags and drove the 2 hours to Wilton, eager to catch up with Sarah and see the new place. I was looking forward to some quiet time away from the hustle and bustle of city life. When I arrived, Sarah greeted me at the door with a big smile. She looked excited, but also a little tired, like she hadn't gotten much sleep. I brushed it off, figuring it was just the stress of moving into a new house. She led me inside, and that's when I first felt that the air was thick, almost heavy, like the house was holding something in. The living room was cozy, with vintage furniture and old photographs hanging on the walls. It looked like a nice place to relax, but the atmosphere was strange. The house had a faint smell of mustiness, like it hadn't been properly aired out in a while. There were creaky floorboards, and every time I stepped, it seemed like the house was groaning under my weight. Sarah noticed me looking around. "I know it's old," she said with a grin, "but it's perfect for me and the kids. You'll see once you get used to it." The kids were at school, so it was just Sarah and me for the afternoon. We sat in the living room and caught up. But every now and then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about the house. The longer I stayed there, the more it felt like the house itself was watching me, like it had a life of its own. After a while, Sarah offered to show me around. We went upstairs to the bedrooms. The master bedroom was large, with high ceilings and a beautiful old canopy bed. But there was something off about it. The walls were lined with old wallpaper that was peeling in places, and the room felt cold, despite the fact that it was a warm day outside. "I've been thinking about redoing the wallpaper," Sarah said, noticing me eyeing the walls. "But I kind of like how it gives the room some history." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the sense of unease. As we walked through the hallway, I noticed a door at the end that was slightly ajar. It was the only door that seemed out of place, as the others were all closed tightly. I glanced at Sarah, but she didn't seem to notice. "What's in that room?" I asked, my curiosity getting the better of me. Sarah hesitated for a moment before answering. "Oh, that's just the storage room. It's full of old junk from the previous owners, nothing special." But there was something about the way she said it that made me want to know more. I walked over to the door and pushed it open slightly. Inside, I could barely make out the shape of old furniture covered in dusty sheets. The room was dark, the only light coming from the small window at the back. It had a strange, unsettling feeling about it, like it was hiding something. "Sarah, are you sure everything's okay in here?" I asked, my voice quiet. She stepped up behind me and gently closed the door. "It's fine," she said, her tone a little too sharp. Let's not worry about it. We moved on, but I couldn't stop thinking about that room. There was something in there, something I couldn't explain. That night after dinner, we sat down to watch a movie in the living room. The kids were still at school, and it was just the two of us. As the movie played, I began to feel the house growing colder, the air growing heavier. I glanced at Sarah, but she didn't seem to notice. She was focused on the movie, her eyes glued to the screen. I got up to grab a blanket from the hallway closet, but when I passed by the stairs, I heard something strange, a faint sound, like footsteps coming from upstairs. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding. I waited, listening, but the sound stopped as quickly as it had started. "Sarah?" I called out softly, not wanting to alarm her. "Did you hear that?" She looked up from the movie, confused. "Hear what?" I hesitated for a moment. I thought I heard footsteps upstairs. She frowned. Here is no one upstairs. It's just the house settling." But something about her response didn't sit right with me. I tried to shake it off, but the unease in my stomach grew. I couldn't get the feeling that something was wrong with the house out of my mind. Later that night, after Sarah had gone to bed, I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet, too still. I kept hearing small noises in the dark, like whispers or the sound of something moving just out of my reach. I lay in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Around 2 a.m., I finally decided to get up and get some water. As I walked down the hallway, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The door to the storage room was wide open. I hadn't left it open, and I was sure Sarah hadn't either. I approached the door slowly, my heart racing. I peeked inside, but the room was empty. Nothing had changed. The old furniture was still covered in dusty sheets, just as I had seen earlier that day. But there was something off about it now, something that didn't belong. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, a soft creak, like someone stepping on a loose floorboard. I turned around, but no one was there. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I couldn't explain it. It was as if the house was alive, playing tricks on me, trying to make me lose my mind. I spent the rest of the night in a restless panic, unable to sleep. The next morning, I couldn't wait to leave. I told Sarah that I was feeling sick and needed to head back home early. She was concerned, but I could tell she didn't fully understand why I was so disturbed. As I left, I glanced one last time at the house on Maple Street. It looked like a normal, peaceful home from the outside, but I knew better. There was something wrong with that place, something dark lurking behind its walls. I would never forget the feeling I had in that house, the way it seemed to watch me, waiting. I never returned to Sarah's house after that weekend. She tried to contact me a few times, but I never had the courage to explain why I couldn't go back. I still don't know what was in that house, but I know one thing for sure. Some houses are better left unexplored.